This is Colonel Conrad Reynolds with the Kernel of Truth. We're at part 2 here with our special guest, Professor Philip Stark, who is a professor of statistics at the University of California in Berkeley. And we've had a great conversation in part 1. And so in part 2, I'd like to talk to the professor about a couple of things. One, a professor in our state, we battle Oklahoma for the last place in voter participation in the country. Very sad, to be honest with you. But most of the people that we have spoken with, and they're very clear. They say, man, I don't think my vote counted. I can't verify my vote. I have no idea how it's being counted. It goes in that machine and disappears. And we want to make a system here in Arkansas that people trust. And we're always looking for your opinion. I know we talked about this a little bit in the last section, but can you talk quickly about what is the system that needs to be implemented for people to trust it, you think?
I mean, first and foremost, go vote, because you're guaranteed that your vote didn't count if you didn't cast it. So even if you don't entirely trust the system, you certainly have a better chance of your vote counting if you cast it than if you don't. We spoke last time about the idea that recording the votes, hand-marked paper ballots, is really the best technology we have for that. It's the most secure technology we have for that. It is not an accessible technology for all voters, so there does need to be another option for voters who don't have the eyesight or don't have the manual dexterity to deal with a paper ballot, to mark it independently. Paper seems very, old-fashioned. Hand marking a paper ballot, seems archaic. Why can't we use computers for these things? After all, here we are. Everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket. It turns out that security properties of paper are really pretty good for this application. So what are those? So first of all, it's tangible. You can account for it. You can say this many pieces of paper went to the polling place, this many came back, voted blank or spoiled. And that accountability is something that you don't get with electronic records in the same way. Second thing is that it is tamper evident. It isn't impossible to change marks on a ballot, but it's hard to do without leaving a trace that you did it. It is human readable, so you don't need to trust a scanner or a memory card reader or a computer to interpret the human readable marks on the piece of paper. A group of people can look at it and decide whether they agree about what the voter's intent was. That's important. Another important aspect for hand-marked paper ballots is that wholesale attacks are expensive and require a lot of accomplices. So what do I mean by a wholesale attack? If you wanted to change thousands and thousands of votes, you would need to go and destroy, add, alter thousands and thousands of pieces of paper, in some sense, one by one. You need to be able to swap out boxes. You need some accomplices. That's not a simple thing to do. Whereas to make a cyber attack on the software that alters thousands and thousands of votes doesn't require a lot of accomplices. It doesn't require access to all the paper. It's much less likely to be detected. So you need physical security to have cybersecurity, but cybersecurity requires much, much more in addition. And so hand-marked paper is just by far and away the most trustworthy technology. But you do have to keep track of the paper. You do need to keep it physically secure. You do need physical accounting, and you do need to make sure that no ballots, fell off a truck or fell on a truck or anything else. And, historically, that's how elections have been manipulated in the United States, is substituting paper or taking paper away or things like that.
But if you had a ballot that you could not, or that was extremely difficult to counterfeit, and you had a finite number, and you were able to, basically it's chain of custody for the ballot. We do that with money. We do that with all types of different things to make sure that there's not additional ones inserted in the system. So that sounds to me like it would be a good thing with a watermark.
there's trade-offs there. So first of all, the watermark isn't going to do you a lot of good unless you're checking enough of them for the watermark to make sure that there aren't a lot of bogus ones there. And I don't think states have a lot of ways of dealing with that. Second, I would definitely argue against putting serial numbers on the part of the ballot that's cast, because then you've just lost all voter privacy.
Right.
And the other, slight pushback, but I do think that watermarking, or I think it's called Frenching the paper so that you can tell that it's authentic, is in general a good idea. Where it becomes a little problematic is if you want to have an option to remotely deliver a ballot, say, to someone in the armed forces who's stationed abroad. You want them to be able to download a ballot, but then return the physical ballot. And they're not going to be able to print it on the special paper. Now, maybe you want to have a special provision for military overseas voters that they can have remotely delivered ballots that don't have that security measure in place, and you deal with that small fraction of the voting population in a different way. But
yeah, I was in the military. I voted for overseas, and they would just send me one in the mail. I would get it. That system's not broken, and it can and it worked out fine. But I understand what you're saying. I'm just trying to think of a way to make sure that there can't be fraudulent ballots inserted into the system. Yeah. We have great county clerks here. We love them. We have great people working, the poll workers. They're all good people, and they're all trying to do the right thing. And I really do believe that they want an honest election. I just think that a lot of them don't really quite understand the vulnerabilities that currently exist in the system that we have now, and so it's an educational process, and it's not always easy. I will tell you, they fight tooth and nail, but I think that that's where we're at now with trying to get them to come across.
I should say one of the audits I've taken part in, which was in New Hampshire, as part of the audit, we did inspect the ballot paper under a microscope and under UV light. We measured the thickness of the paper with a micrometer. We did things to just make sure that the paper was kind of in spec and wasn't something that was substituted from somewhere else. Exactly.
And the UV light is a great one. And I think that with the watermark you could have on there. So I got to ask you another quick question. And this has to do with the companies that use proprietary software. Because we're told, well, we're not allowed to see that. That's proprietary, and that should be, because they're companies, and they're for-profit companies. Therefore, we just have to accept that as part of the having a machine. And my personal opinion is that's not true. But what is yours on the proprietary software?
Well, this is going to be a long and complicated rant. I'll apologize ahead of time. But
go right ahead. That's why we get you on. You ran all you want.
I mean, you could have the devil programming the machines and still have confidence in the election outcome, provided you do an appropriate audit of the tabulation. So let's again separate this into what's putting the marks on paper and what's tabulating the marks that are on paper. So I want to, I'm just opposed to universal use ballot marking devices because there is no way to make them secure. But let's suppose that we have hand marked paper ballots, trustworthy record on paper, and just talk about the tabulation side of things and the reporting side of things. So there is never any way to know what software a device is actually running. Now, it's a good idea to disclose the source of these things because more eyes on it may be more likely to find bugs and or malware. But if somebody wants to hide what's going on, if someone is deliberately trying to hack the machine, they can hack in ways that you will not be able to detect that the software that the device is running is not the software the device claims to be running. So at the end of the day, you've got to take essentially the same security measures, whether that software has been disclosed to the public or not. That said, I think that having contracts that require the source code to be put into escrow and perhaps allow a source code review by trusted parties makes sense. What I don't think makes sense about the current way that we run elections is really the whole economics of it. And I don't think that private companies should be involved in the way that they are. It's one thing, yes, somebody has to manufacture some hardware, but to the extent that we could be using office equipment to run our elections rather than voting equipment to run our elections, using things that are basically commercial off-the-shelf components, that would be far more economical, and it can be used in ways that if it misbehaves, you can catch it and correct it. Again, as we discussed previously, for some functions, not for all functions. So I think that commercial off-the-shelf hardware with open source, kind of publicly owned software would be a much better solution. It would vastly decrease the cost to jurisdictions, both because the hardware they would be buying would be mostly not proprietary, so it would come at the price of office equipment, not election equipment. And secondly, it would open a competitive market for support, maintenance, and so on. Right now, the way voting systems, the voting system economy works, it's not unlike inkjet printers, where the inkjet printer is not the expense that kills you; it's the refill cartridges that kill you.
Right.
And similarly here, the voting systems are overpriced, but what's also overpriced is the third-party contractors that are often involved in configuring the systems for each election, doing the election programming. It's called programming, but it's really sort of configuration. It's not. It's
the ballot styles. They design the ballot styles, and they design correct.
Exactly, and doing the layout of the ballot for each election and things like that. So. If that didn't involve things that were proprietary to an individual voting company, there could be a lot more companies competing for that business. Moreover, it might be possible to have networks of aligned jurisdictions that can provide help and support to each other and eliminate a lot of this expense, basically have a community around it. And right now, some of that's being done by operations that I certainly wouldn't trust, operations that don't have any cybersecurity of their own. I don't know what situations in Arkansas specifically, if there are states that really contract that out to third parties. So I think that having publicly owned voting system software and to the extent possible using commercial off-the-shelf hardware could make elections both more trustworthy, more transparent, and far less expensive to the taxpayer ultimately.
Right. Will, you got anything?
Yeah. So what you're saying is when it comes to the computers in elections, the touchscreen should only be for certain small, specific situations and tabulation. And in those terms, the programming should be open to the public. And that would make people feel a little safer in elections. Is that what you're saying? Am I recapping this correctly?
So I was trying to draw a distinction between things involved in marking the ballot and things involved in tabulating the vote. So for marking the ballot, so what's the same either way? You shouldn't trust the software because you should never trust software. There's just no way to, even if you disclose the source of something, you have no way of knowing whether that's the software that the machine is actually using. If you look at the source code, it's not compiled. You ask the system to say, hey, is this the software you're running? And if it's programmed with malware, it can be programmed to say, yeah, that's the software I'm running, regardless of what software it's actually running. If you ask it to, spit out a hash of its software, again, that can be done, that can be spoofed, that can be faked. So the problem with ballot marking devices and putting technology between the voter and the record of the voter's vote is that, as we discussed before, you're asking the voter to be responsible for catching and correcting the system's misbehavior. You're asking the voter to be your cybersecurity for that device, but voters aren't good at it, and you're not giving them the tools that would let them prove if they had caught the device in the act of misbehaving. So that's just a problem we're stuck with right now. But the fewer voters use that device, the fewer voters use technology to mark their ballots, electronic technology, the better off we are. It's like the fewer votes could be affected by malware or misconfiguration or bugs or whatever. On the tabulation side, so now we've got some ballots that have been marked, whether by machine or by hand. And now let's ask, how can we use technology to tabulate those votes? Do we care whether the software that's involved is open source or not? And what I'm arguing is that I like open source for a variety of reasons, but whether it's open source or not, you still can't trust that software is what is actually running on the device. And you still need to make an end run around it and do some manual checking through appropriately designed audits. The advantage of having open source software there is if it is the software that's really running on the device, you have more eyes on it, more opportunities to catch bugs and other problems. But more importantly, you change the economics of voting systems in a way that ends up costing the taxpayer a lot less.
I got you. I've got another question for you. We have a lawsuit. I don't know if you know that. We have a lawsuit against our Secretary of State and our State Board of Election Commissioners and ES&S. But the reason that my organization, the Arkansas Voter Integrity Initiative, started this is because I read the law, and I'm not an attorney, and I know you're not either, but I looked at it and it said very clearly, I read English, and it says I have to be able to verify my vote prior to me casting it. So if it has a name on that ballot summary sheet and it has a barcode and it reads the barcode, not the name, it can't read the text, then to me, I said, it's clear to me that I can't verify my vote. If it's counting a barcode, I can't verify that. Why do you think that the EAC or any other governmental agency would agree to have barcodes counted?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be able to read the minds of the EAC. I agree with you that we can't read barcodes, and even if you used a barcode reader to read it, and even if it weren't in a proprietary format, often what the barcode says is kind of like, there's a mark in column 1 in the third contest. I mean, in effect, that's what it says. And so you would need to know how to interpret that. Is that a vote for my intended candidate or not? It's not like it is necessarily encoding the names of the people you voted for. It's encoding something that can then be turned into votes. There's a couple of different issues here. One is, what is the official vote? Whether the official vote is the QR code or the human readable text. In Georgia, in effect, the official vote is the barcode. Only the barcode is counted by the machine. If there's a recount in Georgia, unless the court orders otherwise, the recount is a machine recount. So it's just going to rescan the same barcodes again.
We do the same here in Arkansas. So we do the same.
Is it the same?
For a recount, by law, you have to go back through the machine. You have to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in effect, the official vote in Arkansas is the barcode, and that is not human readable, and that doesn't seem like it is consistent with Arkansas law as you describe it to me.
Right.
If the law were different, if the law said the human readable is the official vote, we tabulate using the QR code, but then we audit every contest in such a way as to ensure that if there are enough differences between the QR code and the human readable, we can catch that and correct to change the outcome. We know we'll catch it and correct it, or we have a big chance of catching and correcting it. That would be different. But it doesn't sound like that's what Arkansas law says right now.
I understand. What? Will's got something for you.
Before we got on here, we sent you a video of the Director of Elections for Secretary of State talking about why the Arkansas system is safe. She talked about, we can't read the barcodes, but our audits show that we've been 100% and we do the LNA test and all that. Looking at that video and what you just said about barcodes, is she accurate in saying that, our testing has proven that the system is flawless?
We do have a problem here
because people are listening to
these people who are telling them one thing, and I want people to listen to you guys, Professor Appel, Dr. Dougherty, just people who understand what that actually means, because most people don't. I don't know if you remember the lady who asked the question. She's a representative, and she, it's obvious that she's a great lady, and she's asking a question, but she really doesn't understand the system either, and she's asking the question the best she can. So anyway, don't want to put you in a bad position here, but I would like for your opinion.
So, first and foremost, I don't know what audits she's referring to and exactly what they checked. If all they checked was the presidential contest in a relatively small number of counties, then that tells you something about the presidential contest having been configured correctly in those counties. If there were a problem that was very rare, there might be a very big chance that the way those audits were done wouldn't detect it. If there was a problem that affected other contests, then there would be no chance that those audits would detect it. But kind of more importantly, the fact that you get a clean bill of health in one visit to a physician doesn't mean you're not going to get sick before your next visit. And so the fact that, something has worked in the past or not been discovered to be broken in the past doesn't mean that it won't be broken in the next election, either intentionally or accidentally.
You have a paper that you're co-authored, and it's Ballot Marking Devices Cannot Ensure the Will of the Voters. And I think it's in this one where it's also something about inconsistent barcode attacks. Could you explain what an inconsistent barcode attack is in terms of the tabulator and why the audits that you invented are important?
So if you were going to if you program a ballot marking device to change a voter's votes, there are two things you could do. You could change just the QR code, so it gets tabulated as a vote that's different from what's printed on the human readable portion, or you could change them both. So that a careful person would notice that the plain text of their vote had changed. The name of the candidate they voted for wasn't what they had seen on the screen. So the inconsistent barcode is the idea you could change the barcode without changing the human readable. And from what you described in Arkansas, you could safely do that on any down ballot contest with no chance of being discovered, because the audits aren't looking at the down ballot contests at all. And so if the original count is from the QR code only, and if there's a recount, it's from the QR code only, and there's just nobody looking to see that the QR code doesn't match the human readable part. If you are auditing every contest, and you are doing that audit by manually reading the human readable representation of the vote on the ballot, the names of the candidates, rather than reading the QR code. And there is a big enough difference between, if the QR codes, according to QR codes, one candidate won, but according to the human readable text, it's a different candidate won, then a risk limiting audit procedure would have a large chance of catching that and saying, wait a second, according to the according to the human readable part, somebody else won. But you got to look. You got to look at every contest. And moreover, if we're talking about ballot marking device printout here, we don't know whether either of those things is an accurate representation of what the voter intended. So, yeah.
Got it. Well, I have a couple of questions here. One, could you explain, in your paper you talk about contestability and defensibility, and also evidence-based elections. I'd like some of your thoughts on that.
Okay. So there have been some security properties that it would be desirable for a voting system to have that have been identified for quite some time. I think in roughly 2004, 2006, Ron Rivest and John Wack proposed something called software independence and strong software independence. So the idea of software independence is if there's an undetected change to the software that a voting system is running, that shouldn't be able to cause an undetectable change to the outcome of the election. Strong software independence says you have that, and if there is a problem, you have a way to figure out who really won without rerunning the election. So that's been a longstanding, kind of desirable security property for voting systems to have that some systems have and some don't. It's now been, in some sense, baked into the new version of the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, VVSG2. But my co-authors and I feel that while those are important properties, they don't go far enough. Mm-hmm. And in particular, they don't say who can detect it and what can happen on the basis of the detection. And in particular, if you think about ballot marking devices, an individual voter is in a position to detect whether the human readable printout on their ballot differs from what they put on the touchscreen. So a coding error or a bug or a hack that affected that is detectable by somebody, but they have no way to prove to anybody else that they detected a problem. And that's what led to the notion of contestability. So in that paper, Rich DeMillo, Andrew Appel, and I proposed this notion of contestability, which is if someone detects a problem, there should be a way to produce public evidence of that problem. And otherwise it's going to be, the voter's word against the machine.
That's what it is now. That's what we have now. Right? That's what we have right now.
Yeah. Defensibility is in the other direction, right? Nothing is ever going to go 100% right in any election. Elections are just too complicated. There's lots of people involved. There's processes involved. Something's going to go wrong. And the idea of defensibility is that if the outcome of the contests are really right, if the reported winners really did win, there should be a way for the election official to provide evidence that the reported winners really did win, despite whatever might have gone wrong. And that's the notion of defensibility. You should be able to provide affirmative evidence that the reported winners really did win if they really did win. And if you're using ballot marking devices, you really can't, because there's no way to close that gap between the voter and the printed record of the voter's votes.
So the advice is we got to get rid of the ballot marking devices, except for the handicap.
For minimum, and got to work on figuring out a better solution than ballot marking devices for voters with disabilities that keep them from marking a ballot.
And that gives us the trustworthy paper trail that is the absolute critical in the process of having a secure election.
So let me talk briefly about evidence-based elections. So it's basically that what I was just saying, which is we shouldn't be satisfied with election officials saying this candidate won. We should also require election officials to provide convincing evidence that that candidate really did win. So trust me should not be enough. I used certified software and equipment shouldn't be enough. I followed the procedures shouldn't be enough. And the analogy I use is the situation we're in now is when we have procedure-based elections. We use certified equipment, we follow some set of procedures and rules, and we say, therefore, the outcome is right. And that's kind of like a brain surgeon saying, I used a sterile scalpel, it was certified sterile. I followed the surgical procedure I was supposed to follow. Therefore, the patient is fine. And it's like, well, actually, we need to look at the patient to see if the patient is fine. And we need to look at the election to figure out if the election was fine. It's not enough to use certified equipment and follow the rules.
Got it. Got it. So that's why evidence-based is extremely important.
Let me add one more wrinkle. Okay. And this is a little bit of a dig against some people who are in my community. What I've been trying to emphasize in our conversation or my rants is the need for a trustworthy paper trail as the foundation of trustworthy elections. And I just want to emphasize there's no way to start with an untrustworthy paper trail and then magically restore trust by doing something to that paper trail later. So there are people who are using the methods that I invented, these risk limiting audit procedures, but they're applying them to a paper trail that isn't trustworthy. And that can never show that the outcome is right. It might detect certain kinds of problems, but it's a garbage in, garbage out situation. You got to have the foundation. And doing something fancy, like building a penthouse on a high rise, when the foundation is no good, that's not a good penthouse. You need to get the foundation right first.
Right. Oh, I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. One of the problems that we run into here, and I'm sure in other states as well, is that they go, we have a paper ballot. In other words, they use these. No, it's not. Yeah, it's a ballot summary card, but it's not a ballot. The ballot actually, as we have told people, is what you see on that computer screen. That gives you all your choices, but that is not a ballot. That what you get is not a ballot. But yet that's what they point to try to undermine our argument that. Yeah,
well, forgive me for talking on top of you. I mean, not
okay.
Like I'm already talking enough, but
no, I love it. Go ahead.
So. The election integrity community has been calling for a paper record of the vote for a long time. And I don't think anybody in the community thought that nobody anticipated that people were going to be proposing ballot marking devices for universal use by all voters who vote in person. It's kind of an unreasonable thing to do. It's more expensive. It's more fragile. It's subject to breakdowns on election day. And it undermines, the trustworthiness of what's going on. So I kind of see this as a very surprising success of the voting machine manufacturers and vendors that they've managed to get jurisdictions to spend far more money than they would have needed to spend for a more trustworthy system, and not just spend more money on acquiring the system, but spending more money on maintaining it, setting it up, training the poll workers to use it, training voters to use it, and so on. It's just a lose all the way down.
It's called lobbying, Professor.
Yeah, well, right. So the election integrity community should have been clearer in saying what we really want is a trustworthy paper record, and the way to get that is hand marked paper ballots, not machine marked paper, something or other. And then when you throw in the fact that in many jurisdictions now, it isn't even the human readable markings on that ballot that's the official ballot, either practically or legally, it's even worse.
I agree. Well, what do you say to counties that are considering the move to hand-marked ballots? But they've already spent a lot of money for these machines.
Well, depending on which ones they've bought, those the scanners at least will be able to read hand-marked paper ballots. Some not, but many will. I think ES&S is in that category.
Yeah, it can.
I don't know.
It does.
Yep. So, you got to set up one BMD in each polling place for now for accessibility until we have a better solution than that. And you can keep the others as backups. You don't need to deploy them, and you can save some money each election on not having to program as many of the ballot marking devices, not having to do logic and accuracy tests on as many of the ballot marking devices. Just having the hand-marked paper ballots. It's more economical and it's more trustworthy.
I agree. I don't know that you've done any studying on the cost, but we've done a little bit. We've looked, we've compared. I know that there are papers out there that people have compared, and we think they're cheaper. A lot cheaper, especially over time, because we don't know what the future holds as far as the federal government giving out grants. They've given out billions of dollars, of course, over the last 20 years in order for states to be able to afford these machines. And of course, that was all due to lobbying Congress in order to get taxpayer money to buy them. But if that's not available in the future, they're going to have to put back money now to be able to buy those machines once they become obsolete. And so any thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, the study that I'm most familiar with, the most extensive thing, was work done by Eddie Perez, who was then at the OSET, the Open Source Election Technology Institute. He went from there to Twitter for a while and then back into public domain. He worked for a voting machine manufacturer for years long before that. But he took apart Georgia's cost estimates for their voting system, where Georgia somehow came to the conclusion that ballot marking devices were more economical. And a lot of that was because they included costs for hand-marked paper ballots where they didn't include the corresponding costs for the machine-marked ballots, like the cost of the paper itself. which typically you need thermal paper or something for the ballot marking devices. So that study came out resoundingly in favor of hand marked paper ballots as the less expensive, the more economical alternative that provides the other benefit of being more trustworthy in the first place. So
right. Well, listen, Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. You've been a wealth of information for all of our listeners, and I hope that you come back and sometime in the future. I will let you close. Is there anything that you want to say to our listeners here in Arkansas? And also, we put this online, so it goes all over the country. What would you say?
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show, and I apologize for ranting.
No,
more of a lecture than a conversation. But yeah, do go vote and volunteer as a poll worker, get some insight into the processes, contribute to election integrity, and lobby your election officials for hand-marked paper ballots for voters who have the eyesight and the dexterity to be able to use them. Lobby for audits, because at the end of the day, however it is you tabulate your votes, even if you're going to count them by hand, you still need to check. It's measure twice, cut once in carpentry. Here it's vote once and count a little more than once to make sure you got the answer right.
Well, I want to close also by saying to all my listeners, if you Google Professor Philip Stark, if you Google his name, he's got some incredible papers. But this is for all the election commissioners and county clerks and people who work in elections. If you really want to understand how this system works, you need to read the papers that he wrote. It says there's no reliable way to detect hacked ballot marking devices. That's number one in 2019. And then ballot marking devices cannot assure the will of the voters. Two excellent papers, and I want my readers to read those. But thank you again for joining us. We hope to have you back in the future, sir. And thank you.
Thank you for your hospitality and your kind words.
Yes, sir. Okay. All right. This is Colonel Conrad Reynolds with the Kernel of Truth, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Thank you. Give this video a thumbs up, if you will. Like and subscribe to our channel. Very important for us to spread this message to everybody, and I can't do it without your help. This is the Kernel of Truth, and I'm Colonel Conrad Reynolds, and thank you for joining us.